Welcome to the University Press of Mississippi's virtual exhibit at the 2021 conference of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. I'm Steve Yates, Associate Director and Marketing Director, and I'm here with Alicia Jackson. We'll be talking about her forthcoming December book, The Recovered Life of Isaac Anderson. Alicia Jackson is Associate Professor of History at Covenant College in Lookout Mountain, Georgia. She earned her PhD from the University of Mississippi and is a contributor to Southern Religion, Southern Culture, Essays Honoring Charles Reagan Wilson, published by University Press of Mississippi. Alicia, the arc of Isaac Anderson's life is just extraordinary. Tell us a little bit about his achievements and why he's not already been the subject of a biography.
Great question. Well, a little bit about his life. Isaac Anderson was originally from Georgia, born in Monroe County, Georgia. He was the son of his master. Some sort of notable achievements is that he served in the Georgia Constitutional Convention from 1867 to 1868. He was elected to the Georgia Senate in December of 1870. He would do that at the same time founding what was known as the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, or the CME Church, which is or was a daughter church of the Southern Methodist Church. And part of the reason, one of the other significant achievements that he did was that not only founding a denomination that was independent of the Southern Methodists, but also his election to the Georgia Senate occurred in a time when throughout the state of Georgia in 1870, most of the state leaders that were elected were part of the Democratic Party, which of course was affiliated with the Ku Klux Klan in many cases. And so this particular county that Isaac Anderson hailed from, as well as one adjacent county, were the only counties that elected a full Republican slate to office. And that is significant because Isaac Anderson would be one of two African-American individuals who would serve in the Georgia legislature, the last to do so. And his term would end in 1870. And so that's significant because the next time that you have an African-American serve in office in the Georgia State Senate would not be until the 1960s. So he would be one of the two last to do that. So that was significant. And then, of course, he pushed for a number of policies during his tenure in the legislature, advocating for mixed race juries in trials of Black individuals who were being tried, because that was typically not done. He also advocated for the economic rights of Black individuals, supported the Civil Rights Bill that was being sponsored by Congress, which was in many ways the early version of what would be the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which banned discrimination and public accommodations and things like that. So he was a strong proponent of those things. So that's his sort of major achievements. I think part of the reason why you don't have much of his story is because for many African Americans who did not write their stories down, there was no preserving of their stories. So we have stories about Henry McNeil Turner or Tunis Campbell, who were both in the Georgia legislature because they wrote their stories down. But individuals like Isaac Anderson and countless others did not. And so he had no diary, no biography. All of the story of Isaac Anderson has been put together through years of research and finding bits and pieces of his story. And that's why the book is titled The Recovered Life of Isaac Anderson.
The Recovered Life. So it really was an act of recovery for you.
Yes, exactly.
So where did you turn? I imagine there would have been records maybe in say, a CME archive about minutes of meetings. what did you look to build this recovery?
Right. Well, I looked to some of CME archives. There was some information there, but a lot of it came from his family. His descendants, when I was working on my dissertation, I ran across some information from one of his descendants that gave a little short bio about him when I was visiting Lane College. And they were able to provide me some more sort of stories about and sort of understanding a little bit more about his story and background, so that I could understand who his father was and some other things. But the putting together of a story encompassed me traveling to archives all over the country, whether it be at Drew University or whether it be using Freedmen Bureau records that were not really readily accessible, traveling down to the Houston County archives, which are hosted in a former prison, which is an interesting experience to to do research in an abandoned prison where you're like the only person who's been in there for a whole year. So it was just a real effort of just sort of going to a number of different places to recreate his story and understand his story.
Now, some of what you talked about in his achievements, it struck me that, wow, that's just the Georgia story. His story went even beyond that. So he replaced his white father in the Georgia Senate.
Yes.
He led businesses. He shepherded churches. He founded universities. What character qualities and abilities of Isaac Anderson do you believe sent him always to a leadership role?
Well, you know, one of the things that's interesting, and I think this is part of the reason why the story is such a fascinating story and just not one of these sort of black and white stories. I think in many ways, he was shaped by his relationship with his father, which is such a complicated story because of the fact that his father was his master. His father, when his father served in the Georgia legislature, was very much opposed to Black leadership. And so, for example, his father supported the convict leasing system. His father supported the ousting of Black legislators from the Georgia legislature. So there's this contradiction there, that he would do these kind of things that would in many ways undermine his son. But at the same time, there are parts of his father's life that Isaac Anderson modeled in the sense that, so for example, his father was very actively involved in the Southern Methodist Church. His father for decades served as the superintendent of their Sunday school. His father also was heavily involved in supporting education in their community in Georgia. And as a matter of fact, supported women's education and also was a businessman, although his business was heavily involved in slave trading, as well as having a store. So he had that sort of those kind of things that you see in his story. His son, Isaac Anderson, would be involved in promoting education. As soon as when emancipation occurs, he establishes a school. He tried to do the same thing in Mississippi. You see him being a strong supporter of Lane College, and one of the helps to contribute significantly to the institution. So he's very much involved in education. Later on in his life, you're going to see Isaac Anderson be a businessman in his own right. Of course, he's not dealing in slave trading, but he becomes a businessman and is a very successful businessman in Jackson. So I think that's one thing that's fascinating about this story is that you have these very different individuals who in many ways have very different ideas about, you know, personhood and things like that. But there are these similar sort of traits that you have in terms of their leadership and some of the things that they do in that regard.
Now, this is a story of religion and politics, but also migration and the shepherding of freed peoples. Tell us about these safe havens that are mentioned in the book, safe havens in northern Mississippi and in Arkansas. And in fact, at one point, the adjective progressive is put in front of this, I think, Holly Springs in Mississippi. And of course, we think one thing of progressive today,
Uh-huh.
It would be a little different back then, I'm imagining. What were these places that Anderson was leading people to from Georgia, and what were they like?
Yeah, well, so Arkansas, the initial place that you're going to see that I talk about in the book is Arkansas, where he's going to lead individuals. And Arkansas was uh, it was an ideal place for a number of free people to move to. There was an immigration commission that encouraged Black individuals to migrate there. Frederick Douglass praised Arkansas as being a state where Black individuals should relocate to because of the economic opportunities and that were there. Arkansas adopted legislation that prohibited discrimination in public accommodations. And so, of course, that would later be reversed, but those are going to be draws, and economic opportunity are going to be draws for Black individuals to move there. So you have a number of Black folks who relocate from all over the South, particularly South Carolina and especially Georgia. And they moved to places like Hempstead County, St. Francis County, Phillips County. They moved to those particular areas because of the opportunities to live without a tremendous amount of violence, and also because of the economic opportunity. And eventually that would change. You're going to see a change occur by the late 1860s. And in Mississippi, and there have been some historians who've talked about this, but Mississippi at one point was considered a place that people wanted to relocate to, particularly North Mississippi. We're talking about the Mississippi Delta and parts of North Mississippi, including sort of the sort of outer edge of the Mississippi Delta, including places like Panola County, and also including Marshall County. And the reason being is that landholders and people, they needed laborers. Businesses needed laborers. When we think about the Mississippi Delta today, if you drive to the Mississippi Delta, it is just, you see it as being purely just sort of land, farmland. It didn't look like that well over 100 years ago. There were lots of trees, so there needed to be trees cut. They were also building railroads. So there was a need for laborers, and Black individuals could own land, and there was an opportunity to move sort of upward mobility. So that's going to encourage leaders in the community not to be as hostile to Black individuals. And so that's going to encourage a lot of Blacks to settle there. Also, there are a number of Black individuals who can economic opportunity, but also who can be involved in politics. So probably the most well-known politician who would be a senator, U.S. senator, would be Blanche K. Bruce. Who hails from the Mississippi Delta region, but you have other Black leaders as well who hail from that North Mississippi area. And so Blacks are able to hold political office well into the 1870s. And they are serving as both Democrat, Republican typically, but also in Democratic offices, Democrat Party offices as well.
Wow, yeah, they were breaking the barriers then.
Mm-hmm.
So what did you find in his art that is emblematic of the African American story in the Deep South? And what did you find that was absolutely unique to this remarkable individual?
Okay, well, I think what's emblematic is, especially in the Deep South, I think that there is a sense that sort of this connection to place. I think for him, there is, for a lot, and I think even today, there are a lot of African Americans who have this connection to the South, even though it's fraught with a lot of problems and a lot of people who have left. But I think that there is something about a sense of place. And so for Isaac Anderson, a lot of people later on would leave the South. But I think he tried as much as he could to create a community and space where Black individuals could flourish and be successful, even in the midst of a lot of challenging circumstances. So reason why I said I think that's emblematic of the Deep South is, how many individuals, even during the Great Migration or after the Great Migration would send their children back to the South so they could reconnect with their family and the sense of place. Yes, they would go back to wherever they were living, but I think that is sort of a reminder. People always sort of knowing where your people are from. So I think in that part of his story about again, that sense of place and trying to create and flourish a safe space. I think that's a part of the important part of the story. And I can't remember, what was your second part of your question?
Well, those were the emblematic parts of his life. But what parts, as you were moving through his biography and recovering his story, did you say, that's unique? I've never seen that before in someone who was living and navigating this era.
Right. Well, I will say one of the most clear examples of this is the fact that you would have a father and son who are serving serving in state office during Reconstruction. And so that is something that I think there's not been a case of that. I have not in all of the literature where you have a white individual who is clearly aligned with the Confederacy, the Democratic Party, who would run for office, and then the next go round when his term is up, his son, who's Black, would run as a Republican and win his father's seat. That's unheard of. So I think in that regard, that is a unique part of the story. But I think with Isaac Anderson that makes him a just really fascinating individual is his fortitude, and the sense that even when he was threatened, his own personal well-being was threatened, the well-being of his family was threatened, he still persevered and still was focused in on the goal at hand, which was to provide an education and for Black autonomy. And so I think that's one of the things, the measure of fortitude that he had as an individual, I think was really striking when in looking at his life.
Well, we've been talking with Alicia K. Jackson, and her December book is The Recovered Life of Isaac Anderson. Thanks for coming to our exhibit at University Press in Mississippi. Thanks, Alicia.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Welcome to the University Press of Mississippi's virtual exhibit at the 2021 Conference for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. I'm Steve Yates, Associate Director and Marketing Director, and I'm here with author Mark A. Johnson. We'll be talking about his new book, Rough Tactics, Black Performance in Political Spectacles, 1877 to 1932. Mark A. Johnson is lecturer in the Department of History at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. He is the author of An Irresistible History of Alabama Barbecue from Woodpit to White Sauce. And his work has appeared in such publications as Southern Culture and Louisiana History. Mark, thanks so much for joining us at this virtual exhibit.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Great. Now, Mark, Rough Tactics argues that for African Americans in the nadir of race relations in that period of time, that music held a special power. In the three cases that you study closely in this book, what did African American performers do with music?
Yeah, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Black and white Southerners participated in a vibrant, energetic form of spectacular politics, featuring parades, rallies, marches, fireworks, and other rituals like midnight serenades outside hotel rooms and burning effigies in town squares. As voting rights disappeared, African Americans participated in politics through their participation in these sorts of spectacles. And usually they played their role as scripted. They got on stage to generate enthusiasm for candidates, make noise on behalf of a cause, to serenade a favorable candidate, and much more. But sometimes African Americans went off script to publicly harass, humiliate, or intimidate their opposition or unfavorable candidates. In 1898 in Macon, which serves as one of my case studies, white women set up church organs at polling stations and sang temperance hymns. They wanted to make a final plea on behalf of a local option prohibition law. But the anti-prohibitionists anticipated the methods and organized for Black brass bands to set up across the street from the white women to humiliate and harass them. The Black musicians played ragtime to drown out the temperance hymns. They played drinking songs. I don't think we anticipate Black men in 1898, just a month after the Wilmington insurrection that took so many lives, getting away with this sort of behavior. But these Black musicians did. So I argue that Black music and Black performance generally at these types of spectacles was an acceptable space for African Americans to express their politics and become visible and audible members of the public sphere.
Wow, what an extraordinary opening music made for them then. That's just wild. Now, another case that you bring up fascinated me. The Musicians Union took on the United Confederate Veterans in New Orleans, no less a progressive group than that. What was at issue and how did that turn out? It's really hard to imagine in 1903 New Orleans that a musicians union could take on the lost cause. What was going on there?
Yeah, actually, before I forget, the president of New Orleans Central Trades Council that eventually took a position against the UCV was named Robert E. Lee. So yeah, but moving on. In New Orleans, Black and white workers had a long history of biracial unionism in a lot of different industries, including music. The Black and white musicians there had segregated but cooperating chapters of the American Federation of Music. When the UCV announced that they would go to New Orleans for their 1903 reunion, they needed music for many of their events, including a big parade of veterans on the last day. It was a huge event. They anticipated that schools all along the Gulf Coast and all along, in Mississippi and Louisiana would close for the weekend so that everyone could go. It was a pretty big deal. The White Musicians Union could not provide enough bands to satisfy the UCV for their parade. But they said that they would get some Black bands to join them. Like I said, they were separate, segregated, but cooperating chapters, according to their bylaws. But the UCV balked at this idea of Black musicians leading their parade. When the UCV declined, the white and Black musicians went to their local trades council, like I said, led by a guy named Robert E. Lee, and they added the UCV to a blacklist. So the Black and white musicians of New Orleans, unionized musicians, did not participate. When the news broke out that these Black and white musicians had boycotted the UCV reunion, people came forward with lots of very wide range of opinions. Don't want to exactly spoil how it turned out, but I want to share that some of the veterans actually came to the defense of the Black musicians, but they did for their own ends. They invoked romantic images of the Old South, such as barbecues and balls, in a Gone with the Wind sort of way, at which Black musicians happily played for white audiences deep into the night, right? Where everyone danced and had a good time.
Yeah.
In this way, the UCV could reinforce an image of the mythical Old South by defending these Black musicians and saying that they desired them and that they had a talent for music and that they should play. Okay, so on one hand, they get to invigorate this mythical, happy planter-slave relationship. But on the other hand, they get to officially deny them. Right? So in the press, they get to praise these Black musicians. But in the meeting room, they get to deny them, these unionized professional for hire Black musicians, the right to decide when and where and for whom they would play. So I use this story, which I think is the most documented story in the book, to sort of make a larger claim about why African Americans and white supremacist politicians of all sorts and in all sorts of places made these sorts of arrangements. The white politicians desired Black music because, like these veterans said, it could re-invoke an image of the Old South. They often had at their campaign rallies Black musicians playing Dixie. In fact, W.C. Handy recalls playing Dixie for James K. Vardaman in Mississippi. So they get what they want. They get to invoke that image of the Old South. Meanwhile, the Black musicians get what they want. They get access to audiences, they get paid, they get to showcase their talents, and sometimes they get to turn the opportunity into a place for resistance.
So as you worked, as you wrote this book, what narratives do you feel it overturns? What sort of long accepted stereotypes about this is exactly what it was like for Black musicians within the nadir? Does it flip?
And so after white supremacists retook control of Southern state legislatures and passed all those disfranchisement laws that we know about, African-American power seemingly disappeared, or at least it changed. They focused on upbuilding their communities, right? And challenging the laws in the court system and so on, right? And these laws had a devastating effect on Black voter turnout and Black power. In my book, I make a few contributions to this existing narrative. First, I argue that spectacle remained a central part of politics. By participating at campaigns and rallies and parades and fireworks and whatnot, African Americans had some influence on politics and their circumstances. Sometimes they did not get much, I'm willing to admit. Maybe just a few dollars, an appreciative audience to hear their music. But I don't want to dismiss this as trivial either. At spectacles, people form their political communities as they gathered with fellow partisans to rally and gather in town squares and watch election results unfold outside the newspaper offices and experience the highs and lows of watching those returns come in. I want to point out that African Americans were visible and audible members of all of that ritual of democracy. Like I said, in most cases, they played their role as scripted. Handy recalled playing for James K. Vardaman, playing Dixie, listening to a hateful speech. He did his job, showcased his talents, got paid, and moved on. Even though, as he recalled, it hurt him a lot to hear those sorts of words. But in some cases, African Americans took these roles a bit further to harass or intimidate politicians. Like in Clarksville, Tennessee, where Black musicians played funeral songs to humiliate a white supremacist candidate in advance of the election. With this book, I also want to, add to the power of these musicians. I know a lot of scholars have done a lot of great work on the power of music to, like example in the juke joints, right, to express themselves and express things that African Americans could not say when white eyes and ears were listening, like frustration with working conditions, their desires for love, their complaints and mockery of white society. They also have pointed out that on stage, they could play like feckless minstrel type characters and get away with mockery of white society to an extent. I want to take that same sort of dynamic and bring it into the public sphere with politicians on stage and, with white women on the streets, like in Macon. I think they were able to get away with a lot more than maybe we've given them credit for in the past. And finally, I think we need to take a closer look at municipal politics, especially when it comes to issues of reform, like I do in the first section of the book on prohibition in Atlanta and Macon. On the local level in the South, white Democrats controlled everything. But when white Democrats divided on issues, a small number of Black voters voting as a bloc could make a huge difference. So whenever an issue or campaign divided the white electorate, like prohibition, a few Black voters could tip the scales. In Memphis, right, the three candidates vying for mayor in 1909 were all white supremacist Democrats. They all had policies from the outside that would probably look mostly the same, but which one could offer enough in terms of power, service, patronage to get just enough Black voters on their side? So in this book, I explore the dynamics of Southern politics in the street and in the ballot box.
Wow, I think music is going to teach us a lot about that dynamic, and you've certainly taught me a lot today. This is wonderful. We've been talking with Mark A. Johnson, and he is the author of the new book, Rough Tactics, Black Performance in Political Spectacles, 1877 to 1932. Thanks for joining us, Mark, at the Association for the Study of American Life and History. This has really been great.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Welcome to the University Press of Mississippi's virtual exhibit at the 2021 conference of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. I'm Steve Yates, Associate Director and Marketing Director, and I'm here with author Kristin Waters. We'll be talking about her forthcoming November book, Maria W. Stewart and the Roots of Black Political Thought. Kristin Waters is Professor Emerita at Worcester State University and resident scholar at the Women's Study Research Center at Brandeis University. She is author of Women and Men, Political Theorists, Enlightened Conversations, and co-editor of Black Women's Intellectual Traditions, Speaking Your Mind. Kristin, thanks so much for joining us at the virtual exhibit here today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Now, Maria Stewart is not a name that we know and associate with the development of Black liberation and gender equality. Who was she, and how did she publish and make her ideas known in 1833?
Well, Steve, I once again want to thank you, and I want to thank the University Press of Mississippi for bringing this book to the public. I'm just so happy. I'm going to add a little note here. In the 19th century, they usually pronounce the word the name we call Maria, Mariah, and that's just common throughout the 19th century.
How interesting.
Yeah, and most people don't really know that unless you've got your head deep into this stuff, as I do.
Well, this is why we publish books.
So let me start out by saying the simple version is that when Mariah Stewart, a former indentured servant, was just 29 years old, she walked into the newspaper office of the foremost white abolitionist of the day, William Lloyd Garrison, and handed him an essay she'd written called Religion and the Pure Principles of Morality. He published that essay, launching her brief but productive career in support of what she called African rights and liberty. Often that term African in this period of time means African American. And then, of course, also, especially in the 18th century, many of the people who were enslaved were in fact African. So that was the common usage. But this simple telling of the tale leaves out a powerful account of a great and forgotten liberation movement that stretched from the 1770s to the 1830s and even to the present. Mariah W. Stewart and the Roots of Black Political Theory tells that story. So briefly, there were three major avenues for liberation that African Americans wrenched from the white social order in the late 18th century. One, military contributions. Two, Black Freemasonry. And three, Black religious societies. Militarily, in the Revolutionary War, thousands of free and enslaved African Americans put their hearts and lives into the effort to oust Great Britain for the simple reason that they believed the rhetoric of the Declaration of Independence, that all men were created equal. They thought that an American victory would bring an end to slavery. Men like Peter Salem and Crispus Attucks. Second, Freemasonry. Prince Hall, who's just a fabulous young organizer from this period, and his comrades, formerly enslaved, brilliantly perceived that the secret society that catapulted men like Benjamin Franklin and George Washington into power was especially well suited for African Americans, who had really few places where they could evade the scrutiny of the white domination. And one of those places was Masonic orders, because it was a secret society.
Right.
So they used that, and there were Black Masonic lodges all over the North in this period of time. The third prong is the religious societies and eventually the Black churches of the day. What does this have to do with Mariah Stewart? This brilliant young woman arrived in Boston to find a very well-organized community. And she was fortunate enough to meet people who were uncommonly well-suited to nurture her intellect, preparing her to become a political philosopher. Reverend Thomas Paul, David Walker, and her husband-to-be, James W. Stewart.
Oh, so it's for an arena for a public intellectual, you couldn't imagine better. Now, Mariah, you mentioned religion. Mariah said that without liberation applying equally to all, I'm not quoting, but she said essentially this: without liberation applying equally to all, some of the founding ideas of America become hypocritical expressions of an ungodly white power. What was her religiosity and spirituality? It must have been so well grounded and quite powerful.
It was, and that's, that is a really good question. She grew up, she was indentured in the home of a white clergyman. So she was surrounded by religiosity. As she says, I was pious from a young age. And then she had a meteoric rise in fortune when she married James Stewart, who was a wealthy Black shipping agent. And her fall was equally precipitous when in short order, her husband and mentor, her husband and her mentor, David Walker, and her friend, the minister Thomas Paul, all died within months of each other. At that moment of despair, she had a conversion experience. She became, as we say, born again.
Oh.
And at that moment, she lost her fear of death and her fear of white people. She said, look, they're going to kill you. They're going to kill you one way or another. Why be afraid? Bring it on if need be.
What a transformation.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it?
Wow.
So she wrote, I have two quotes here that I'd like to read for you. Mm-hmm. She wrote, "Why should one worm say to another, 'Keep you down there while I sit up yonder, for I am better than thou.'" And then in terms of an ungodly white power, she wrote, and this is so powerful, I think, "Oh, ye great and mighty men of America, ye rich and powerful ones, many of you will call for the rocks and mountains to fall upon you, to hide you from the wrath of the Lamb and from him that sitteth on the throne, whilst many of the sable-skinned Africans you despise will shine in the kingdom of heaven as stars forever."
Oh my goodness, that's just lovely and thunderous.
She's a beautiful writer. She's such a beautiful writer.
Wow. Well, now, what was her impact in your estimation? While history may have lost track of Mariah W. Stewart, and now thankfully we all have a book, so they can't lose track of it. But what did she shake up in her day?
So she didn't have a lot of impact in her day. Mm-hmm. A lot of people didn't like the idea of a woman speaking in public. And she packed up and left Boston, which I think she thought was a little provincial. She went to New York City. And then she went to Baltimore and on to Washington, D.C. I think her greater impact is more recently. Marilyn Richardson republished her essays along with a beautiful biographical essay in 1987. And her work has also been taken up by Patricia Hill Collins, Catherine Sophia Bell, Valerie Cooper, Brittany Cooper, Jacoby Carter, Jose Medina, Stephen Wheelock, all in the last, 10, 15 years. And that Black scholarship has really intensified. And as that's happened, Stewart's work is really beginning to take center stage. So I believe in the next 5 years or so, she will be much more commonly known and recognized as the progenitor of Black political and feminist thought.
Well, what led you to her originally? I mean, when something is hidden, it doesn't always attract a biography like this, a great work like this. Why did you choose to write about her?
There was a great reclamation movement, both in ethnic studies and women's studies, starting about 30 years ago. People were looking for and finding people who had been marginalized and brought them to the center. And so I was attracted by this. And in 2007, I co-edited a book with Carol Conaway, Black Women's Intellectual Traditions, which you mentioned. A quarter of that book, and we sent out for essays, quarter of that book are essays on Mariah W. Stewart. This is 2007. I think that when that book and other works of reclamation came into the hands of a new generation of scholars, to use Stewart's term, her words like fire inspired this new generation to continue reclaiming their traditions. And I think Mariah W. Stewart and the Roots of Black Political Theory is the logical extension of that book. And I can't thank you and your co-workers at the press for recognizing that.
Oh, well, we're delighted. And this has been delightful. Thank you so much for spending time with us at the virtual exhibit. We've been talking with Kristin Waters, and her November book that's forthcoming is Mariah W. Stewart and the Roots of Black Political Thought. Kristin, thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it.
Welcome to the University Press of Mississippi's virtual exhibit at the 2021 conference of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. I'm Steve Yates, Associate Director and Marketing Director, and I'm here with author Thomas Aiello. We'll be talking about his forthcoming October book, The Artistic Activism of Lumumba Brath. Thomas Aiello is Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at Valdosta State University. He is the author of several publications, including The Grapevine of the Black South, the Scott Newspaper Syndicate in the Generation Before the Civil Rights Movement. Welcome, Thomas, and I'm really looking forward to talking about this fascinating book. In 1963, at the height of the Southern Civil Rights Movement, Cecil Brathwaite, under the pseudonym Cecil Lumumba Brath, created and published a bombshell of sorts. What was it, and what was its impact?
Right. So in 1963, he publishes this book called Color Us Colored. And it was a comic book of sorts. He called it a coloring book. And he uses coloring as a theme throughout in the way he describes these figures. But he takes 20 of the current civil rights leadership, whether they be political, religious, or entertainment, and holds them to the fire. He draws them in satirical ways and then writes commentary that is designed to criticize their direction, largely in relation to their proximity to white people, their emphasis on integration, which he didn't think was the way to go, and really created this funny takedown of the modern civil rights movement.
And he was advocating in some ways for more action, faster action, or was he criticizing the sincerity of these figures?
It's a good question. In some cases, he is criticizing their sincerity, but for the most part, it is the philosophical trajectory of what they believe. He comes from a strain of Black radicalism that we don't talk about as much during the civil rights movement, a Caribbean strain of radicalism that dates back even prior to Marcus Garvey. He was very much a Garveyite Pan-Africanist. And as you might imagine, someone with that kind of Marcus Garvey background is going to see the modern civil rights movement as something lacking. And nobody escapes his pen. While he's critical of Martin Luther King and Louis Lomax and James Baldwin, he's also—
Sammy Davis was in there too, right?
Sammy Davis is in there, Eartha Kitt. I mean, he'll go after those people, Dick Gregory, people that we consider to be icons today, but he's also criticizing people like Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad, who we tend to kind of caricature as being to the left of those people. And so he sees all of them as being too vanilla when it comes to civil rights activism and in their willingness to negotiate with white people and to accept integration as a viable reason for activism.
So this was, it was almost a proto, as we say in the book industry, adult coloring book, or was it comic book, or was it a cool mishmash of both?
It was a cool mishmash of both. He calls it a coloring book, and I guess theoretically, adults, it was very much for adults. It was not for children at all. But yes, it could be an adult coloring book, but but really he's using that phraseology less because he wants people to color it and more because he's using the metaphor of coloring in all of his descriptions. So what he does is each page is a different figure, and he draws a picture of them in a funny situation or maybe a recognizable situation. And then he writes a brief caption for the photo that kind of portrays his criticism of them and what they're doing wrong in his eyes. And all of it is themed with color as the main theme of that. And so that's really where he's coming with that coloring part. It really is just a comic book, but yeah, I guess you could say adult coloring book. It is theoretically colorable.
Right. So now what was its impact? I'd imagine there were some people who were a little furious and put out with him.
Oh, sure. No, I mean, as you might imagine, when you take down some of the figureheads of entertainment and the civil rights movement, it's going to cause some controversy. The Black press, which normally hewed to a more moderate stance, is going to write some nasty reviews. On the other hand, some people, some presses very much liked it and saw it as valuable. We are in 1963 starting to see a more radical turn in the civil rights movement anyway. The bloom hadn't completely come off Dr. King's rose, but certainly there was a groundswell in the Southern movement even at this point, kind of against his leadership. So, I mean, this idea wasn't a foreign concept to a lot of people. I think in the white community at the time, civil rights was kind of cordoned off as this one thing, that kind of Africa is a country model where just civil rights is a thing. They don't really examine it enough to realize that civil rights is actually a bunch of different things and a bunch of different positions, many of which are at odds with one another, that it is not an entity. It is a variety of entities under kind of one larger banner. And this book really kind of gives lie to that unity and kind of shows some of the cracks in that particular armor and the dissatisfaction that some people on the radical Black left felt with the way things had been going in a time of otherwise, generic victories. I mean, we are moving towards the Civil Rights Act. I mean, we are a year away from that. We are making progress with a lowercase p, but for some, it wasn't the right direction and it wasn't enough.
Okay. And so then this really put even more layers to the idea that the civil rights movement was by no means a monolith. It was many different movements within a movement.
Absolutely.
But I wonder this, was there something made more powerful when that critique came in a graphic form? Is it maybe even more satirical a jab at leadership when something is drawn and visualized rather than just in an editorial or in an interview or a pamphlet, or when someone's furious with another leader?
Absolutely. One of the people pilloried in the book is Dick Gregory. And as Dick Gregory could tell us, I mean, funny things get people's attention. On top of that, you're dealing with an impoverished population that doesn't have the same literacy rates across the way. Comics are a great way to express opinions without requiring that kind of literacy. At the same time, he's very much playing with popular culture of the day. His picture of Eartha Kitt, for example, is a mock-up of a cover she did for Life magazine, something that people would have noticed or seen on the shelves in stores. And so by creating this kind of vehicle, you're giving access to way more people that might, it's a book, but it's 20 or 25 kind of important pages. It's not something you have to slog through. It's not something you need an education to understand. Satire gets to the heart of these things without requiring those long-term explanations that a lot of people simply don't have patience for.
Okay. So then what happened to this highly charged adult coloring comic book? And what happened to Alambe Brath?
Well, the coloring book does very well. It goes through 2 printings and sells out both of them. It is essentially a self-published thing. It's published by one of Alambe Brath's organization, the African Jazz Art Society, centered in Harlem. But it makes its way across the country, sells out 2 full printings, does incredibly, what gets in all the Black newspapers, obviously, whether they liked it or they didn't like it. It becomes this kind of cause celeb. A lot of people hadn't heard authoritative voices that criticized some of the Black leadership that weren't racists. You know, I mean, most of the time, whenever you heard anybody bashing Dick Gregory or Martin Luther King, it was a Talmadge figure. It was somebody, it was a white leader who thought they were wrong. To hear a critique of these people, including people like Malcolm X, who are often the critics of those more mainstream civil rights leaders, all lumped together and criticized by a Pan-Africanist thinker, very much in the tradition of Marcus Garvey, was revelatory, I think, for a lot of people. And it helps push a new radicalism as we move forward into the mid to late 60s, as we see the civil rights movement really change and turn against a lot of those original integrationist principles into something more vociferous, ultimately leading us to Black studies departments in universities and other things like that, which attempt to do a Garvey-style cordoning off of the Black experience within white spaces. As for Brath, he stays doing artistic work for much of his life. His day job was as an art director at ABC in New York. He worked for the American Broadcasting Company for most of his life during his day job. But in his private life, his activist life, as befits a Garveyist pan-nationalist, he begins transitioning most of his concern towards Africa, and in particular African independence movements, as they are breaking away from European colonial powers. And his most important organization in that regard becomes the Patrice Lumumba Coalition, which he spends much of his time with. He spends a lot of his life traveling back and forth to Africa. He is part of the delegation that welcomes and fetes Nelson Mandela around Harlem and the country. He is friends with all the major African leaders and really starts to do a lot of more foreign policy related things as the 1960s progress. But his domestic policy work featured in this book is really seminal as well. Along with the coloring book, we also have the full run of his comic strip that he did for the New York Citizen Call, which really provides the seedbed for all of that work. Groundbreaking political cartooning in the best tradition of the Black political cartoonists of the early 20th century in the Black press. So he really has a varied career.
And you're really giving us a big look at it. I will not only have the Color Us Colored book reprinted within the book that we're bringing out, but also that full run of the comics that you talked about, and then your analysis of who he was and what this means, right?
Absolutely. We give kind of a full history of Caribbean radicalism and how it diverges and differs from other kinds of Black activism. We talk about Alambe Brath's biography. We talk about the history of Black satire. We try to take every single aspect of his work and really put it into a context that everybody can understand, which will allow you to then just enjoy what he's done here. And we include all of his published artwork in all of its different phases. We also include essays of his to give you an idea of his writing style and how he interpreted his own work kind of theoretically later on in his life.
Well, that richness is the kind of thing that has our staff so excited about the book. We've all been talking about it and saying, look at this and look at all the things that it's going to do. I'm so glad that you had a chance to talk with us, Thomas, and thanks for being with us at ASALH. We've been
Thanks for having
talking. Oh my goodness, yeah. We've been talking with Thomas Aiello, and we've been talking about his forthcoming October book, The Artistic Activism of a Lumumba Brat. Thanks a ton, Thomas.
Thank you.